Yeah, so what is the good life? When we first sort of came up with this as an idea for a series, I was like, this is going to be awesome. And then as the days approach where I realized I'm going to have to say something about it, I was like, I don't know if this is such a good idea. Um, yeah, because it's a bit of a big topic for a Sunday morning or for the next couple months. But it seems essential. It seems like a question that we hover around, that maybe sits in the background of just about everything we do. Every kind of relationship, job, friendship, um, choice you have during the day, and even events and circumstances that seem out of your control, somewhere in the background is a question something like, what is the good life? And of course, it's a very ancient question, which is like, on one way, in one sense, is encouraging. I'm not here, sadly, to now tell you what the good life is. I know, sorry. I wish, because then we could make millions, Come to this one place at this one time uh, in this one building and find out, the secret. So it doesn't work quite that way. And I was inspired by Mary's meditation this morning with this phrase, blink of time, or just like this little blip. Or as Jung put it, um, we're just, what did he say? We're a blink, something like that, between two great mysteries. He meant birth and death. There we are. So it's a little blip between these two great mysteries, which is kind of humbling. Which, in one sense, is the reason why I think we ought to be talking about what is the good life. What is this blink or blip that we're passing through between two great mysteries? And um, and also with Jung, who I wasn't planning on talking about, so you can tell he's working his way into my unconscious, and it just comes up all the time, and I can't help it. Um, but I think he was very much into tensions. That really the point of life is these living with the tension of opposites. So, and you can universalize that. Everything has the tensions of opposites, and particularly around the question of the good life, because I'll give you one tension of opposites. My good life might not be your good life. Well, there you go. There's a tension of opposites. What is personally interesting or might bring me personal happiness may conflict with yours. So now we're right smack in the middle of the tension of opposites, which cannot be resolved. It has to be lived with. And perhaps part of the good life is learning to live with the tension of opposites like this. So, I want to try to talk about that over the next couple months. And particularly this morning, I think we have to go ahead and just begin a conversation about happiness. I love the Dalai Lama just coming right out and saying it. Let me see. I put this quote in here and I can't remember it. Since our goal and the purpose of life is happiness, first of all, you might think, is that really true? If you're a good old Protestant, you'd say that's not the point of life. But he just comes out and says it. But then he also says, in that, you have to ask then, what is happiness? Of course, he takes it in the direction of satisfaction, which is an interesting path to go down. But something of what we would call happiness, or maybe happiness needs some clarification. That's what I'll try to do today a little bit. But let's have a conversation about happiness because it sits right at the heart of the American experiment. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of? Except Jefferson originally said property. Did you know that? Yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And yeah. Changes things, doesn't it? Yeah. So, um, yeah. So Franklin came along and said, that's too narrow. And they agreed. And so they changed it to happiness, which broadens it. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's have a conversation about happiness as best we can, at least acknowledging that it needs some clarification. And let's talk about Protestants for a second, because America, I've been reading a lot of American history lately, is there's something about the Protestantism that is behind the American experiment. There were Catholics that came over, but it was at least initially largely a Protestant experiment. And with Protestants, they brought all kinds of interesting, speaking of tension of opposites, you have sort of two extremes in the Protestant world, and I'll try to summarize them briefly. The first is sort of the Puritan, anti-pleasure, even anti-happiness approach to life. Basically, if you're happy, something's wrong. Really. And you have to sort of examine your own worldview for a moment. like if the sun is warm and you're standing outside in the spring, you're like, this is glorious, and one part of you says, it's not going to last, That's like pretty deep inside this Puritan sort of anti-pleasure kind of makeup. That if you're happy, something is wrong, and especially if you meet other people who are happy, then definitely something's wrong with them, And either God's going to get them, or if He doesn't get them now, He'll torture them forever in eternity. Then, they'll get their ultimate, what's due them. So here's another one that's sort of along the same lines, that if it's fun, it's somehow sinful. Somehow sinful. You should not be having fun. And then there are various definitions of fun, and you can have certain kinds of fun, but they're really not that much fun in the end. So it's another one to watch out for. But on the other side of I think a largely Protestant mindset is almost the polar opposite, and that has to do with a word like blessing. So there are a couple of variations of this. So one is, if I'm experiencing a lot of success, it's not me. I'm just blessed, God has blessed me with this or that. Yeah. Now, He couldn't be bothered to get involved with something like the Holocaust, but my personal, the fact that my 401k is really, it's God. He's just felt like getting involved, just for a minute. Now He's out again. So, but that's very sneaky. That is very sneaky kind of theology, really, that is. There's something good in there. I always try to look for some good in there, and probably the good in there is a sense of maybe it's not all about me, That's a little bit good, and maybe it's not all about God has blessed me with this or that. Might be a way of getting closer toward I didn't create all this, So there might be some good in there. But the other trickier side of a word like blessing, which shows up now, particularly on television with these televangelists, is that basically if you do the right thing, believe the right things, pray the right prayers, and of course give money, then you're going to be blessed. And that's going to lead to your happiness. That's what it's about. It's about your personal happiness. But you got to play the right theological game for God to want to do that for you. And if you really play the game well, you too can have a private jet. It's possible. And there are examples of that. So this is surprisingly attractive to people, especially when they're, the extremes that I'm describing. It's surprisingly attractive, and it seems to work pretty well. So a few years ago, I was out to lunch with someone, and a fairly successful, wealthy person. We were at Five Guys Burgers and Fries. So, and so he asked me a question. I don't think anyone has ever asked me this question before. He said, "Does God want us to be happy?" And I was like, I really didn't know what to say. I think I said something like, I don't think God wants us to be unhappy. What I should have said is, I have no idea what we're talking about. I don't know what we mean by God right now. So, but I was out to lunch. I was just trying to be a friendly guy. And so he then said, I think God wants us to be happy. Look at me. He was saying, not me, but him. I'm really happy. I'm super blessed. I've got, loads of money. I mean, he was That's what he was saying, but he was giving examples of loads of money. And that's because God wants me to be happy. And all I have to do is believe that God wants me to be happy and believe in a few other things besides that. And then, voila, magic. Which is a very interesting kind of theology. As if God is like playing a game up there and he's like, got a little t-shirt cannon of happiness. And I'm just making this up as I'm thinking about it. And if you play the games right, then you'll fire off a material possession that you put on. And that, of course, makes you happy. So happiness is an odd thing to talk about. By the way, James Hollis, another Jungian, says right now we live in a cult of happiness. That's what he calls American Western society. It's a cult of happiness. And yeah, that seems about right. It seems about right. What is it that we're worshiping? Happiness. And what do we mean by happiness? Largely personal happiness, correct? Personal possessions, property, well-being, and it's a cult. It's a religion. It's a religion of happiness, perhaps. That's my phrase, not James Hollis's. So, what am I saying about this? There's something about the conversation around happiness that seems to have two sort of dimensions to it. It's private, or another way of saying it is it's individualistic. And even when it's hard to even talk about happiness because we have to immediately defer, especially if you're a postmodern person like me, that like, who am I to say what's happiness for you? Correct? Like right away, we can't make any universal claims, which keeps it in a very privatized arena. What's good for you is good for you. What's good for me is good for you. Except there are limits to that, correct? You say, no, there are no limits to that. Yes, there are limits to that. Just think about those parents who locked up their own children for decades, chained them to their own room. Well, that's part of their personal happiness. Who are we to say? What's good for me is good for me. We say, no. We don't want to go in that direction. So we know there are limits, but we're not sure how to talk about those limits for one thing. Am I right? Yeah. So maybe privatization, private individualistic happiness has major limitations and might, in the end, not make us all that happy to begin with. Like, we had the little pre-talk before the talk, and someone was talking about when they were a kid, they worked at the drugstore, and as part of a perk, you could take whatever you wanted from the soda fountain. And so for the first, few weeks, then it was every day was a sundae, making a sundae. And but that gets old, and then you sort of forget about it and you move on. The thing that you think, wow, basically unlimited access to pleasure ends up wearing you out and making you sick. So yeah, this cult of happiness around individualistic pleasure, essentially, maybe is not really the greatest way of thinking about it. I was talking about with a friend of mine about this, and we were using the metaphor, he was using the metaphor of a house. And we were talking about a number of things just going on in our culture, but if you imagine a house right now, and you live in this house, and one of the rooms of the house is your own personal happiness. Can you imagine that? And you're living in this room. Are you there? And it's possible then to convince yourself that the only thing that matters in this house is my personal room. Correct? What's in my room? What would make me happy in my room? What are the lights like? The bed table, the books, the TV, whatever. I don't know. Whatever you want in your room. It's up to you. But the reality is, the fact is, your room is inside a larger house. And in the cult of happiness, what we tend to preach is just arrange things in your room the way you want them arranged that will make you personally happy, and who cares about the rest of the house? The rest of the house could be on fire. You're like, well, I've got a sprinkler system, so You know, what do I care? And I'll just turn the TV up louder when people are screaming and banging on my door. Like, sorry, I'm watching Friends. I don't know. Do people watch Friends anymore? I don't know. I never watched Friends. I don't even know I ever thought of that. All right. So yeah, that for me is a metaphor that works. So a couple things about the founding fathers, because I personally like to mock the founding fathers because they're because everybody worships them. Well, not everybody. Certain people do, and then say, well, come on. But I read an article by Kathleen Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's daughter, this week because I was hunting around for some good things. She had an article on the founding fathers and what they meant by happiness. You can find it online. I think it was in the Atlantic. And anyway, she said that part of early American conversation around the time of the founding fathers actually had to do with that word. What is meant by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Which, by the way, speaking of a giant question mark, is a good way of starting. What do we mean by? So in other words, it wasn't something that was very clearly defined, but rather was something that had to be struggled with. And the founding fathers were struggling with this word, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What do we mean by that? And one of the things that she said, which I thought was pretty powerful, she said that the modern contemporary person living in the 21st century, when they hear a phrase like no taxation without representation, what many people seem to be moving toward is really the first half of that phrase, which is no taxation, correct? What moved the founding fathers was, she was saying, was the second half of that phrase. What they wanted was representation. And as soon as you move toward representation, then you're talking about communal aims. You're talking about a society. You're not talking about individual personal happiness. What would make me personally happy is no one takes anything that belongs to me, no taxation. What they were saying is not no taxation, but representation. That somehow we have to hold this thing communally, which I thought was a very interesting observation. She also said something that I thought was quite powerful. She said that the founding fathers were really wealthy white men. Now, did you know this? Really wealthy white men. And what was interesting about them is that they could have taken their private property and private wealth and lived out the remainder of their days fat and happy. But what did they choose to do? They chose to take their personal wealth and their power and turn toward the communal good. She says that's at the heart of the American experiment. Now, you can say, well, they didn't, some of them had slaves. Okay, I understand all that. But in terms of one's orientation, you would think, why not make it a life where I did it my way, I got all I could, I'm living, chilling in my pad, and I don't know, do people use that phrase? You probably don't. You could that seems to be, why not just do that? And she's saying because at the heart of the American experiment was a sense of the common good, which is why I put in this little line from Robert Kennedy. Listen to what he says about gross domestic product, which, by the way, right now, with the present administration, that seems to be their solution for all problems. Growth. Did you know, now I'm about to get fired up. There is nothing natural about continuous growth. It actually, it's a fantasy. It doesn't even exist. You cannot perpetuate. Nothing in nature operates that way, which means it doesn't exist. But if that's our solution to all problems, then we're going to wind up in serious trouble. But I love this. This is from a politician. Gross domestic product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Now that just cuts it off at the knees. Whether it's happening or not, it doesn't tell us anything about what's worthwhile or what the Dalai Lama meant about happiness, which is satisfaction. It does not satisfy some sort of deeper craving. just amassing more and more and more and more and more. Except if you get the latest version of the iPhone, you will be happy. That's the big lesson from today. So I've wasted a lot of time. That was all my introduction. Because what I really wanted to do was talk about Aristotle. Because Aristotle is the one that started us down this path of what is the good life. This was his fundamental question. What is the good life? It came from two words put together in Greek. Eu, which means, well, I wrote it down. Well, means well. And daemon, which can sound a bit like demon, which was their word for the lesser gods. All right? And they called that happiness. So eudaimonia meant happiness, well-being, so well as in well-being, and your spirit or spirits or lesser gods are put together. That's happiness. Happiness is probably not the best translation for what Aristotle had in mind. Probably something like flourishing is what Aristotle had in mind. You already feel the difference, correct? If you're flourishing, that's a lot different than just being privately happy. And we all know if we're talking about just an emotional state, well, that's not going to last anyway. And emotions, so what? They come and go. I mean, they can come and go in the middle of this talk that I'm giving. I may say something that you're like, now I'm angry, and I may say something that now I'm happy. Who cares? You're up and down the spectrum. A better question is, what is leading to an overall sense of well-being or flourishing? So that was Aristotle's big question. What makes up a life of flourishing? He said there are three illusions. Wealth. Okay, now this is 300 BC, let me remind you. 300 BC. Wealth is the first illusion. Wealth will make me happy. Why? Because he says it never stops. It's never enough. You could be a billionaire and the president of the United States, and it's still not enough because someone didn't thank me, I'm just making that up. Not that would actually happen, but think about that. Aristotle, 300 BC, said it doesn't satisfy. Okay. Number two, what was his other thing? Honor. Now the Greeks, especially Romans more than Greeks, but they loved honor. But he said honor is not about flourishing and well-being. Why? Because it puts that on someone else. You're then dependent upon someone else's praise, approval, accolades to receive honor. Imagine if there was leaders who behaved like this. Okay? I know it's so easy. It's so easy to pick on. I only do it because it's a giant mirror. It mirrors back to us what we are like. It's really true. And the third was pleasures. And that one's pretty straightforward. Pleasures are just fleeting. That's it. They come and go. And even the Epicureans, who were much more into pleasure, admitted too, they're fleeting. They're fleeting. They have to be rooted in something else. All right. So this is what Aristotle said briefly. You need basically two avenues or paths to the good life. And tension of opposites. They both have to exist. He said, one, he called, for lack of a better word, the intellectual virtues. Okay, so what did he mean by the intellectual virtues? Reason, the intellect itself, study, contemplation, learning. It's part of the good life. He said you need these, what he called intellectual virtues, which he said actually leads to a feeling of joy or a feeling of happiness. Learning, studying, growing. And with that, we can make that even more narrow. Just what are the things that make you come alive? You should pursue these things. What are the things that make you come alive, that make you feel alive and grow and flourish personally? He said those need to be there. But on the other side of the coin, he said we need virtues of character. That if it's just about, in other words, what makes me feel good, the things that I'm into, If that's not balanced in some way by what he calls the virtues of character, then things can go awry. Then you can end up living in a room inside of a house that's on fire. Okay? What did he mean by virtues of character? Good old-fashioned words like courage, temperance, generosity. These are basically outward focused things. How do you practice generosity? Alone. Well, you don't really. I mean, I suppose you can be kind to yourself. I get that. But you can only be generous to the community and world around you, correct? So he's balancing out basically a sense of private well-being, your own reason, mind, intellect, what makes you come alive, feel alive, with virtues of character, how you behave out there in the world toward other people. And let me try to balance it some other ways. Happiness, this is from Aristotle too, has to be balanced with what we would call moral responsibility, which is kind of disappointing. You know, really? Who wants to talk about morals, you know? Lame. There shouldn't be any morals, except then the house burns down, we would say. So anyway, he kind of leads us in this direction. By the way, here's just like, I was on a podcast like a while ago. I don't know. And this person was asking me, because we were talking about Christianity and what happens once Christianity sort of unravels. And he said when he was a kid, the big threat was if God goes away, then everybody becomes immoral. Like there's no sense of like right or wrong. And by the way, this is like a fair question because Christianity is unraveling in America as we know it. So is that the society we're going to? And he was telling me that when he was a kid, they were saying all atheists essentially are completely immoral. Well, apparently they've never read the Greeks because, I mean, Aristotle's having this conversation without the sense of a Christian God, essentially. Now, I know they had gods, but we don't get into all that. So it's possible to talk about morality and ethics without a theistic sort of worldview. I'm just as an aside. But I still think that's kind of an important question because what's much easier is to say, well, God has set up the world in this way, and as long as we follow that, then society will be ordered and so forth and so on. Well, if that is being called into question, which it is, how are we going to have this conversation? Well, one thing we don't want to do is just avoid the conversation and say you can't talk about morality and ethics anymore because everything is just a pluralistic flatland. Now we're back to that kind of crass example of then you have parents living in a house chaining up their own children. We say, hey, we can't have any conversations about what's moral, immoral, or ethical, or we can't do that. No, we must do that. Which puts us in that tension, private well-being and what's part of the common good. So, 2 more points with the Greeks. One is, what is the role of the state? Okay, this is also Aristotle. The state comes in to try to help all live well. That's the highest view of the state that Aristotle had. Doesn't have any individual in mind, but it tries to step in its own limited capacities to seek the well-being of everybody. That's the state's role, which I think we probably need a reminder of. What's the state's role? To get out of my way, so I can get all I can. No, at its highest, it's to have in mind the well-being of everyone, which Aristotle said is related to happiness or well-being because there are always factors that are out of your control. I'll give you one. The zip code you were born into. Correct? No one consulted you before birth and said, hey, where would you like to be born in the world? What kind of family? What kind of economic structure? Where would you like to go to school? No one consulted you. In other words, you can just be born into poverty, or you can be born into wealth, or fill in the blank. So Aristotle said this is true, and it does affect people's well-being. When they are born into a situation where there is where they don't have access to clean water, they don't have an education system, they cannot pay the bills, this affects their well-being. The state should take some responsibility in trying to help that. That's Aristotle's view, which I tend to agree with. So, what's my summary? What is Aristotle's contribution? Now, some philosopher in here is going to send me an email and say, you don't get it. All right, I probably don't. What do I think Aristotle's contribution is to the question of what is the good life? Here it is. We cannot privatize the good life. That's the major Greek gift to the world. We cannot privatize the question of the good life. We have to hold it in tension with the whole. This week, this teaching, I'm largely talking about the human world and what we would call human culture. In a couple weeks, I want to talk about the more than human world, which is David Abrams' lovely phrase, the more than human world. Aristotle's not so much talking about that. So, let me quote some St. Paul, because why not, He says, when one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. That's his metaphor. That is a true metaphor. Unless you live in a room by yourself with a sprinkler system and you've convinced yourself the house is not on fire. Back to that metaphor, you're there in your room. If one room is suffering, what then is true? You are suffering. Now, you may be in denial about it. You may think, I'm fine, I've got Netflix, who cares? But Paul is saying, if one part of the body suffers, the whole thing is suffering. That is very much like Aristotle, saying you cannot privatize the good life. We must have concern about everyone in the polis. Now, this is the point of my talk. I'm so excited about this right now, because I didn't know this. The point of my talk is, do not be an idiot. Okay? Why is that funny? Because the word idiot in Greek means a private person. See? The idiot was a private person. Concerned about, I did it my way. That's an idiot. How have we lost this wisdom? This is wisdom. So, the person who is an idiot does not care about the polis. That was the Greek word for city. The community is not a participant in communal life, is not concerned about their neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself is essentially it's just shared communal responsibility. That's all it is. You cannot live like an idiot and expect to be happy. And we kind of know that anyway, deep down. A super private, what are you going to end up on your own island alone somewhere? Is that the ultimate aim of all this? That doesn't seem very life-giving. Certainly not flourishing. That sort of thing. So, I think, I had one more point, but I'm not going to give it because I think that's a pretty good place to end. And I do want to take you back to the original quote here. There's a misprint in the opening words here. So this is Richard Rohr. He says, "Your life is not about you." Now that's kind of disappointing, right? And it's a hard lesson to learn. Your life is not about you. But the second half of this, it's not. It says in the bulletin, you are about your life. Actually, that's not what he said. He said, you are about life. Your life is not about you. You are about life, which is much more expansive. So let's try the opening words as there should have been printed. Your life is not about you. You are about life. Thanks.